Hey, this is Tom Mason, and today I'm going to show you 3 kinds of armature stands you can use when sculpting your miniatures. Armature stand number 1, the trusty old cork. This is what the very first thing that I use. This is probably one of my earliest corks as well. And it actually took me a little bit to find this because I have not used a cork in quite some time, with the exception of specialty uses such as this. I can show you right here, but I'll get into that in a minute. The cork is great, one, because it's cheap. It's available. You can probably find it at any hardware store. The key is, and you get them in various sizes, but the key is you want to get one that is going to be similar in size to your base, especially if you're going to sculpt a tab on your miniature. So as you can see, this one right here is almost the exact same size as the top of this 25mm base. So just to show you the size here, this top portion is about 22mm, which is pretty close to the top of the base. And the bottom here is just under 30, so 29. These are great, again, because they're cheap, but also because they do a good job of holding your armature in. So here I have just an old wire armature I made. I go ahead a lot of times and make pre-made armatures so that I don't have to sit and make them right when I'm ready to sculpt something. I kind of do them in batches, that way I'm ready to go. What I'm doing here is you can press it in with your hands, but sometimes it's a little difficult. So you just get a little pair of pliers, and with the excess wire that's on the bottom of your armature, you can just drive it down in here. Now, one thing I should note, this armature is not posed. You would typically want to have at least the legs posed how you want them to go, because obviously once it's in there, you can't really slide it out side to side or anything like that. But what's really cool is, once it's in there, it's nice and secure. I'm pulling on this with a bit of force and it stays put. And when you put your initial layer of green stuff putty down here, or other epoxy putty, that starts to tack on to the cork and hold the miniature in there even further. Now, I mentioned you could get these in different sizes, and you can even get them in different styles. So I'll go over this one first. So I use these larger ones for bigger creatures, but also you can see here I have these extra just randomly stuck in there and formed wires. Well, I use these a lot in order to help prop up things like capes or other elements that might be flowing and up, and where you don't want to actually have an armature in it, but you need to have something to brace the putty or material so it doesn't fall until it starts secure. So what I'll do here is, when I'm initially sculpting, I might set it up and actually have these independent, form this, lay this on there. But if you want to make sure that things stay put and are more in a situated environment, you can tape these together, form them together just so they don't go anywhere. Obviously with these you have to be careful because they will turn up in an angle like that, but that's a good use. You also have these smaller ones, and again, you can get plain cork ones this way, but these ones I specifically like to use for 15mm miniatures. And I found that using these black rubber stoppers instead of the cork ones for the 15mm, they tend to stay in there a little bit better. The 15mm wire is so thin and you have so little that you tend to drive down into here that it's just a nice surface and weightier, so they tend not to fall over just because there's not as much going on there. And right here, I don't know if you can tell, there's a little bit of a gloss there. So you don't have to do this, but I like to put a piece of tape over top and trim it down to size. And that just gives you a nice smooth surface, so it's very easy to pop everything off when you're done sculpting. So I've gone over a lot of the positives and the benefits of these. I mean, there really is no reason not to use these if you just want to get something cheap and easy and ready to go. But there is a slight downside. One is you will end up replacing these over time. Like I said, you'll end up putting putty down here near the feet, and when you pull these away, you know, even if you use a knife to kind of pry it off, you'll end up just destroying or damaging the surface over time. You know, as you press the holes in, you can see I've got some different size holes, so you end up with these kind of gaps where putty can glob up and you have to do a little more cleanup, and you just don't have a nice smooth surface. In addition, at times, even though this does stay in there pretty well, if you do have to pull out the miniature for some reason while you're in the middle of sculpting it, just to get into some weird or tight areas, you know, finding the same place or the right place, it can be a little bit stressful on the armature, plus it's hard to find the exact same place. And once you remove it and try and put it back, it does get a little bit easier to pull out, especially depending on what your stance is, if it's very wide, or if you have a character who's here. Well, here's a good example. So this one right here, it's higher up, so actually the legs don't even go all the way down, and if you have one leg planted and one leg up, you just end up having some more dynamics to work with. But all in all, they are great little armature stands, and I really recommend them, especially when you're starting out. The second armature stand is definitely my favorite. I'm not gonna lie, this is the one that I use for almost all my sculpting, but definitely watch to the end because the third one has definitely some good uses, and you will find certain times that you'll want to do it. So the sculpting block here is basically an upgrade of the cork. Obviously you have to fabricate it or buy these. I do sell these on my website, but I moved to these basically the first time I saw Bobby Jackson using one. I went ahead and went home and started making my own, and I've never looked back. So these are great for multiple reasons. One, the surface lasts almost forever, unless you're really sloppy and gouge it with a knife. It will stay like this forever. And I should point this out. So what this is really, this is basically 2 pieces of 1/2 inch wood cut down once again to the size of your base. So basically the exact size of a 25mm base, give or take. It's all right if they're a little thinner because you're going to end up wanting to make the tab. So that ends up, what this does is it helps ensure that you won't ever make your miniature's stance too wide to make a tab or have it work within your game system. Very important. Whoops. A lot of people disregard that, certain miniatures lines, but very important. So the biggest reason that I like this, you know, besides the surface staying clean, very smooth, so you have less cleanup to do and worry about, this is my #1 reason for using the sculpting block. So rather than having to, you know, take a pair of pliers and drive this wire in and hope it doesn't get jammed up or moved or hit something, all you have to do is unscrew this a little bit, set your armature in. Again, after you pose it, especially the legs, you want to get the legs posed so they're at the right width and stance. You just set it in and then you screw it. You can hand tighten it, you can use a plier if you need to get it a little bit tighter. And as a lot of people point out, I use just a bolt and a nut, very simple. I've seen some people use wing nuts, which definitely is easier to turn. The reason I don't do that is I like to keep these as low profile as possible. Even though a wing nut back here probably isn't going to get in the way of my sculpting tool coming at the miniature from this direction, I just like it being a more low profile, easy to hold block. So as you can see, you set it in there, you screw it, and it's in there. And the best part is, if you do have to remove, you know, you can pull on this with great force. It's not going to come out. But if I do have to remove it, all I do is unscrew it, miniature comes out, and there we go. And if I need to put it back in, you just tighten it down, and you don't need to rely on the cork having enough tension being placed back into it. And I don't have to worry about, you know, the fact that I'm not going to be able to grab the miniature from up here without damaging it. You can just set it right in there, lock it in place, and you're good to go. The other great thing is you can use these sculpting blocks to hold completed miniatures in place. Now again, if they have an integrated base, you'll have to do the same thing I mentioned before, where you just put some green stuff here and press the model onto the top. But if you do have a miniature with a tab, these are always the trickiest thing to secure. all you do is press it in there, press the tab in there, and I do recommend doing this because otherwise your tab will slip out. So you want to get a little excess piece that's relatively the same size as your tab. I always just press this in the bottom, set that in the bottom first, set the miniature on top. I'm sure you've seen me sculpt this miniature and some others the same way. And what that does is it just evens out the spacing, so there's even pressure on the top and the bottom. And you get a really nice hold, keeps it in place, and it won't damage the miniature either. Now the third and final armature stand I like to use is a pin vise. Now you can use a pin vise or hand drill, as this is sometimes called, some clamps. Basically what you're doing here is you're taking your armature and you're only putting just the wires in it with as minimal gripping surface. Well, that's not even true. You're gripping, you can grip in one or both, but the point is it's very minimalistic. You don't have a wide area that can get in the way of your tool. I should show you. So we have this tool, before, when I was sculpting on this miniature, you're coming in from the side. If you want to get something underneath, you have to hold it more horizontal and tap up. That's the same with this one or the cork, just because of the nature of this flat surface. You can get in at an angle, but depending on how the miniature's standing, sometimes it's a little tricky. So it's really important to get in with basically any angle you might want to do on your tool. These are great because there's really nothing there. It's super, super small. And I usually don't sculpt an entire miniature using this method. This is something I'll do as I go along, or if I've got a really tricky spot, because it's normally not going to matter when you're bulking things up, being rough with your details. But every now and then you have something really particular that you need to get at. This is a great way to deal with that. Now you could sculpt the whole miniature this way. I actually do know a few sculptors that have little clip devices they've designed, or pin vises like this that hold it in place. And I would suggest, if you wanted to do this, doing one that can kind of clip both of these, just to help support your figure more, because as you can see, when it's just on one foot, especially depending on how weak your wire is, this is pretty substantial wire. This is 24 gauge steel. So it's pretty hefty and doesn't bend super easily, but once you start getting in it and pushing and whatnot, it can move around. Now obviously the only major downside to this is you cannot put a miniature on there. I mean, if you wanted to, you could cut this off or pin into the foot and do it that way. But it's also not really a problem, because frankly, if you're just sculpting a little bit on an existing miniature, most of the details are already there. You're adding some detail to one spot, and heck, you don't even technically need a stand to sculpt an existing miniature. You could just grab it, supposing you're not trying to add detail on an area that makes sense for you to hold. Well, there you have it. These are the three types of armature stands I have used or I'm still using. In summary, the cork is a great starter one, very cheap, but by far this is my favorite. It's super versatile and easy to use. I've got a video that shows you how to make it, or you can buy one from my site if you don't want to invest in the time and money and power tools. And lastly, we have the pin vise, which is just really great, especially when you have special circumstances and you need to get at your sculpt from different angles. But whether you're using a cork, sculpting block, or pin vise, you still got to remember, keep sculpting.